All right, Rabbi, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul. Shindy and Avram Kalman for dedicating all the Sherman Trushos this month in honor of Yechiel's engagement to Alana Falik and in memory of our parents, Jerome and Bernice Kalman, Alexander and Frederica David. To thank Barak, Maya, Sandy Hoffman, Dora Limas, and Avi Malamed for dedicating the shiur in memory of Ruvain ben Emmanuel, Zichron Livracha. To thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the shiur in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Shulamis Bas Susha. To thank Daf Yomi Shir for dedicating the shiur in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Yehuda ben Michal. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Jeff and Karen Cohn, for dedicating the learning in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Jeff's mother, Eleanor Cohn, Elka Bas Binyamin. To thank Louis Goldberg for dedicating the Week of Learning, thanking Hashem for the engagement of his grandson Eli Bogart to Rivi Galaskov, daughter of Steve Galaskov. To thank Joseph and Ellen Miller, Iris and Ed Miller and family, Leslie and Adam Miller, and Rosen and family for dedicating the Shurim this week. L'zecher Nishmas Richard Berman, and the schos of our learning, may his neshama have an aliyah and the family a nechama. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Morty Tusk in honor of his wife Malki on the occasion of their 25th anniversary. Beautiful. And to the friends of the Langbaums in honor of their upcoming aliyah. Emir Hashem b'sha'a tova u'metzlachas. Today is Dr. Langbaum's last official day in Shir, as he will Emir Hashem be zocha to go with his family, to go with his wife. For the rest of his family's there. A lot of his family's there. Emir Hashem making a beautiful, beautiful journey to Eretz Yisrael. May it be with incredible mazel, hatzlacha, and bracha. Now, also with that, let us begin. I apologize. Apparently, we do not have a microphone today. I think it is time for us to invest in Emir Hashem in our own Daf Yomi microphone and speaker. Okay, dedication opportunities are open. All right, so we'll say, so let us begin. So we have a lot to do today and not a lot of time. Again, we have a little bit of a shortened window during these days of Slichos. So we will, Emir Hashem, do our best to maximize the time that we have. So we'll say today's daf is Ayin Hay 75, and we are picking up on Ayin Daled Amud Beis 74b, the last line. My time is Rabbi Huda. So we'll say, remember again, Rabbi Huda said in yesterday's daf that kol neder sheyadu bo rabim lo yachzir. Remember again, we're speaking about the situation if a man divorces his wife because she made a neder. So Rabbi Huda says, depending on the type of neder, triggers this halacha. If it's a neder sheyadu bo rabim, a neder that the rabbim know about. And Rashi said over here, Rabbi meant asara, 10 people, then he's not allowed to remarry such a woman. But if it's lo yodu bo rabbim, if it's a neder that the rabbim don't know about, then he is permitted to go ahead and remarry her. So it says the Gemara, my time with Rabbi Huda. What's Rabbi Huda's logic? Tichsiv, top of ayin hey, v'lohikum b'nei Yisrael ki nishba'u lahem nisiyeh ha'eda. Interesting for both says this happens to be a fascinating story. This is the story of the Givonim. So remember again, the Givonim were a nation, an indigenous nation in Canaan, who were in existence at the time of Yoshua. Now remember again, the mandate for any indigenous nations in Canaan was that either they are free to leave Canaan as Klal Yisrael comes in, or ultimately, again, they would be conquered. The Givonim disguised themselves as a foreign nation, someone outside of Canaan. They introduced themselves to Yoshua. Yoshua and the Zakanim made a treaty with them, but then when their deception was discovered, Yoshua felt that he could not go back on the treaty. So they were made into water carriers. They served Klal Yisrael. The point over here is because this was a neder that was made publicly, there was no revocation from it. This is the source, or revocation of it. This was the source of Rabbi Yehuda's ruling. V'kama rabbim. How much is a rabbim? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Shlosha. Right? He says 3. So Yamim Shnaim. So the Gemara says Rabbim Shlosha. Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Asara. So Rabbi Yitzchak says no, it means 10. So the Gemara says Eda Ksiv Bahu. After all, again, because it says the lashon of Eda. Okay. So Rabbi Meir says Kol neder shetzarich hakiras chacham lo yachzir. Rabbi Meir says any neder that requires the chakira of a chacham. Now, both say again, remember, the chakira of a chacham is a neder which requires a chacham to really get involved in understanding the mechanics of it. Ultimately, if a man divorces his wife because of such a neder, she is not permitted to go ahead and return her. Rabbi Lazar Omer, Lo Asru Tzarich Elam Mipnei She'eno Tzarich. Rabbi Lazar says, ultimately, again, they only assert a neder that says Tzarich Hakiras Chacham, lest you come because of a neder She'eno Tzarich. So the Gemara might come if what are they arguing about? So we'll say again, remember, this whole thing was represented a little bit of a tangent on our primary sugya. What are they arguing about? Rabbi Meir Savar, Adam Shirotze Shetisbaze Ishto Bebezdin. Rabbi Meir holds that, remember, we had this interesting lashon in yesterday's daf, which literally means a man wants his wife to be degraded in Beis Din. Now, of course, remember, we explained that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case. Not the pshat that a man wants his wife to be degraded. Rather, what's the pshat? A man is okay if his wife has to go to Beis Din in order to revoke her particular neder. Rabbi Lazar Savar, in Adam Rozeh Shetisbaze Ishto Bebeis Din. Rabbi Lazar holds that no, a man doesn't. In other words, a man would rather his wife not be degraded in Beis Din. Rava says, Rava Amar, Hacha be'isha chashuva askinon. Rava holds that here, what are we talking about? An isha chashuva, an important woman. Da'amar lo necha li de'itzar bekravo seha. So Rabbi say this is interesting. So the Rava suggests over here, we're talking over here about an isha chashuva, and a man says, ultimately, again, I don't want to become prohibited in her relatives. In other words, even if I'm not going to be married to her, I don't want to create a situation, ultimately, again, where I'm precluded from marrying into the family. Da'amar, if that's the case, Seva diktani, aval husha halach eitzel chacham, v'hetiru, eitzel rofe v'ripa, also, mikudeshes. So we'll say, remember again, this references back to Braisa that we had on the top of Ayin Dalet Amud Beis in yesterday's daf. What was that Braisa? So we'll say that Braisa was, remember, the case we dealt with was that a man made a condition. He was Mekadesh al Tanai. What was the Tanai? Hariat mikudeshes li amanas she'in alayach nidarim. Or amanas she'in lach mumin. Right? You have no mum. Right? And what happens? She had an neder, but she had it revoked. Right? In other words, after Kiddushin, she had it revoked. Or she had a mum and it was healed. So if you remember again, we'll say, what was the distinction in the Gemara, in the Braisa? For neder, she's mikudesh. Remember again, why? Why? Because revocation is retroactive. For mumin, for a mum, she is not mikudeshes. Why? Because the healing of a mum only works mikan ulahaba. So now the Gemara quotes, we didn't quote this yesterday, but the Braisa quotes the reverse case. What happens if halacha l'maisa, avalhu, Rashi says over here, first short line in Rashi, avalhu, im amar la amanas she'ein alai mumin unadarim. So we'll say, let's say the man made the reverse tanai. He said to her, become mikudeshes to me on the condition that I, the man, I don't have any nidarim, or I, the man, I don't have a mum. And then again, same case. It turns out he does have a nidar, he does have a mum. But what's the halacha? Avahu shalach eitzel chacham v'hetiro. He goes to the chacham, and the chacham ultimately again permits him. Or eitzel rofe v'ripa, or he goes to the doctor and he's healed. What's the halacha? Mikudeshes. We'll say in both of these cases, ultimately again, it's mikudeshes. Lisni Eina Mikudeshes. Ultimately, again, they should also say Eina Mikudeshes, like I said, by the woman. And we can see over here, we're talking about, again, an important individual from an important family. The Amra, because she could say, Lo necha leidi bikreveha. I don't, even if I can't be married to him, I don't want to be usher to his relatives, and therefore I'd rather the dissolution of the marriage than the divorce. So the Gemara says, this is fascinating. About say, Ihi, this is a, oh, Harry, thank you. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. So the Gemara says, Ihi b'chol duhu nechala. Well, this is actually a fascinating societal statement. A woman is happy with any husband. Right? A woman is happy with any husband. Now I'll say, what does this mean? From a woman's perspective, it is better to be with someone than it is to be with no one. I think is the popular Ma'amar Chazal goes, right? If you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with, right? So Lamaisa. Ari, thank you so much. Thank you. So I'll say, so what's interesting about this, and remember again, what I want to point out over here, I will say is just it's a societal thing. Remember, we've spoken about this many times, that marriage for a woman represented a sense of physical security, financial security. So when Chazal say like this, like a woman would marry anyone, right? They don't literally mean a woman would marry anyone, but what it means was that, at least historically, a man was much more selective about who he was marrying than a woman, right? Because a man had the luxury of being much more selective, whereas for a woman, ultimately, again, marriage was an absolute necessity for her physical and financial security. So the Gemara gives some examples of this. Amar Abaye says, Dishum Shemana Gavra Korse Becharsa Ramila. So Abaye says, even if a woman is married to a very short man, Shum Shemana Gavra means a man who's as tall as an ant. Right? In other words, even if a woman is married to a very short man, she could put her chair. Rashi says, Kurse Bechorsa Ramila. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, Kurse Borchorsa Ramya, Kisa ben Hasaros benos Chorin Moshiva, Kolomar Gamli Bal Kimochem. She could literally put her chair amongst the free women. In other words, marriage affords a woman a certain level of status. So she said, even if her husband is as short as an ant, at least it allows her to place her chair amongst the other free women. Rapapa says, the nafsa gavra tikre b'seifa bava v'tesiv. Rapapa says, even if a woman's husband is a nafsa, Rashi says, nafsa is menafes semer v'umnos musi. He combs wool, which was considered to be a very degrading profession. Even if her husband combs wool, ultimately, again, she will call with him and sit down with him in front of the house. In other words, that even if a woman's husband has a degrading profession, she's not embarrassed to be seen with him. Not embarrassed to be seen with him. Okay. Ravashi says, the kal segavra lo boy talfichi lekidra. If a man has blemished lineage, right, like blemished yichus, he won't even demand lentils for dinner. In other words, that Lamaisa will say. So this last one is interesting. This is saying if a man has damaged lineage, right, has an issue with his yichus, ultimately, again, he's just happy that someone married him, and he'll be a very undemanding husband. So the Gemara ends off with saying something very interesting. Tana, the kulan mizanos v'tolos bebalein. And all of these women, they end up committing adultery and ultimately attributing their offspring to their husband. Okay, so that's a pretty sweeping statement, right? What the Gemara is saying is that sometimes, so again, when women settle for these types of marriages that seem to be an ill-fitted match, sometimes it is a cover, ultimately, again, for immoral behavior. Okay, I will say, by the way, whenever the Gemara says kulan, all of them, remember, I will say, kulan is never meant as kulan everyone, right? Because again, the truth is, in general, when it comes to human behavior, you can never go ahead and make a statement that says v'kulan, something applies to everyone. It just means that sometimes these mismatched unions are a cover for some type of inappropriate behavior. Good. Kalmum and Shepolson. So we'll say, so remember again, an interesting case here. So the Mishnah said, any woman that are postin. So we'll say, so here's what's interesting. The Mishnah pointed out that any mum, any physical blemish that would go ahead and would invalidate by a kohen, ultimately invalidates by marriage as well. So the Gemara, when we say invalidates by marriage, could be grounds for dissolution of the marriage. Als mekachto. So we'll say first wide line, ayin here, when Aleph 75a. Come on, Moshe Polston. Tana, hosifu alei and zeya. So we'll say in it. So there are certain women, however, that would allow for dissolution of the marriage, even though it's not a mum by kohanim. So the Gemara says, what are some examples of this? Zeya, if a woman sweats profusely. By the way, we'll say whatever woman we talk about, you understand, they go both ways. It's illustrated as a mum for the woman, but whatever is a mum for the woman is going to be a mum for the man as well. So zeya, someone sweats profusely. Shuma, a mole. Reach hapeh, chronic bad breath. So the Gemara says, Vahani bekani lo pasli. but do these mumin not disqualify by Kohanim as well? Vatana we learned hazokein v'hachola v'hamezuham. So Rabbi said, this is actually very interesting. So this particular Mishnah over here is actually talking about animals, right? That if animals that, right, invalidating factors in an animal for a carbon. Zak, the animal is very old. Chola, the animal is very sick. Mizuham also means that the animal smells. The animal smells. Look at Rashi. Legabe mume behema tanan v'kasakatay tchavrea zeya v'reach haped the adam b'chlam mizuham. So Rabbi say you see that a mizuham, a very smelly animal, is ultimately cannot be used for a carbon. So we're assuming over here that halacha lamaisa, chronic bad breath and constant perspiration, which also yields body odor, are also disqualifying factors by Kohen Vutinan, Mumin Elu, Bein Kvuin, Bein Ovrin, Psulin Ba'adam. And also we learned that these same type of Mumin, whether they are established, in other words, permanent, or passing or temporary, ultimately passel a Kohen as well. So you see that if a Kohen has a terrible odor, that also invalidates him from doing the avoda. Therefore, I will say, so whether that's terrible odor or chronic bad breath, or whether that's body odor, that ultimately would go ahead and preclude him. So what's interesting about this is, the Gemara just said before, right, we made a statement in the Mishnah. What was the rule in the Mishnah? Any mum which disqualifies a Kohen will also be problematic in the context of a marriage. So the Gemara said, but in addition to the mumin of a Kohen, we also add in, that's what? Perspiration, a mole, and bad breath. But at least perspiration and bad breath seem to be included in the mumin of a Kohen. To which the Gemara says, there's different types of perspiration. Also, ultimately, again, there's perspiration that is a temporary issue, and then there's chronic perspiration, to which the Gemara says, Rav Ashi Amar, Zeya Amazon Karamis. Rav Ashi says, no, you're talking about two different things. They both say there's a difference between Zeya, someone who perspires a lot, someone who sweats a lot, versus Mizuham. They both say, so Zeya means perspiration, which of course does lead to body odor, versus Mizuham, which is a state of intense body odor. So the Gemara says, Hasam Gabe Kohanim, Afshal Avra Bikiwa Dechamra, so we'll say, Umerecha Panami Afshar Dinakat Pilpula Bepume Vavar Avoda. See, even if a Kohen has body odor, so all you need to do, I will say, is, see, if a Kohen has body odor, I don't need, or bad breath for that matter, we don't need to cure it. What do we need to do? Treat it, right? Treat it. And how long do you have to treat it for? Just while it's doing the avoda. So in other words, Rabbi say, how do you cure body odor? This is actually how do you treat body odor? Interesting, a bath of wine vinegar. Fascinating, right? A bath of wine vinegar. So Rabbi say, all you need to do is before he has to do the avoda, let him take the bath of wine vinegar. Or for bad breath, pilpula b'pume, put a pepper in your mouth. I guess it's like this is the Talmudic Listerine strip, right? So let's say, so just put a pepper in your mouth, and that's it. In other words, that there's a way to remedy this situation because I don't have to cure it. I just have to take it away during the window of avoda. So the Gemara says, "Aval gabe isha lo efshar." But we'll say obviously that works in avoda because all I have to do is treat it episodically when he's doing the avoda. What I can't do is what? It's not going to work in the context of a marriage. Because in the context of a marriage, if a woman has chronic bad breath, or for that matter, again, if a woman has chronic body odor, what are you going to do? In other words, it's a chronic issue will undermine the marriage. So the Gemara says, fine. So I'll say that's body odor and bad breath. So the Gemara says, Hi Shuma Hechi Damyo. What's the case of the mole? Se'ide ispeisar hacha b'hacha pasla. So I'll say, interestingly enough, a mole that has hair apparently is considered to be a mum, both by Kohanim as well as by a marriage. To which the Gemara says, idalo isbasar, and ultimately again, if it doesn't have hair in the mole, so ishuma gidolahi hacha v'hacha pasla. So if it's a large mole, again we'll discuss what large means, right? Right? Then ultimately that's a mole. Ishuma kitana he. If ultimately again it's a small mole, hacha v'hacha lo pasla, then both by marriage as well as by kahuna, ultimately, again, it won't invalidate. I will say, by the way, I'll just mention the concept of mumin by Kohanim is very interesting. In general, why is it that a mum, right, apostles according from doing the avoda. So as Menachem just mentioned, this incredible Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch says that when people come to the Beis HaMikdash and they observe the Kohanim doing the avoda, ultimately we want them to focus on the avoda. When a person has a mum, it's a distraction. It's not the Torah chas v'shalom going out and discriminating against people with handicaps or with different. Let's say it's just the idea over here that when we know this, when a person looks different, does something different, by definition, my attention is drawn to that. We don't want distractions in the Beis HaMikdash. A person's coming, we want them to be wholly, totally focused on the avoda. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, what type of mole are we talking about over here? And if it's a small mole, then again, a small mole is not a mum. Tisanya, because we learned, Shuma sheyesh baseyar, if you have a mole that has hair, harez a mum. That's a mum. Ein baseyar, if it doesn't have hair. Right? Gidola, if it's a large one, harez a mum, it's a mum. Kitana, is a mum. So if easy gidola, I will say, by the way, what is considered to be a large mole? Perush of Shigmaliel, ad ki isser ha'italki. The size of an Italian isser. Size of an Italian, we should also say the post can bring down quarter of an inch. That's a large mole. Amrav Yossi ben Chanina. So we'll say, what's the case? So what's the case of the mole that could potentially be a mum for marriage? Be'omedes al padachta, where the mole is on her forehead. The Gemara says, padachta, if it's on her forehead, ra v'nefayis. Then ultimately what? He's seen it. They're both saying, see, here's the chap. Right? If the woman has a mum, again, I want to be clear. I'm using the case of a woman as a mum, but just to be clear, remember, all of these cases work both ways. Right? Reuven's going to marry Rachel. Rachel has a mole on her forehead. He sees it. If he sees it and he marries her anyway, what does that tell you? He was makabelit. So the Gemara says, padachta rav nefayis. He saw it, literally again, he accepted it. So the Gemara says, Papa, no. Ba'omedis latachas kippah shal rosha. Ultimately, again, where it sits underneath her kippah, right? Also, we saw this before, that a woman would often wear some type of hat, and therefore, again, which is interesting because here apparently she's wearing it even when she's not married. So I will say, so some explained, by the way, that the kippah was like a small hat that women used to wear because they would balance a basket on their head. So the kippah was there, between her head, between her scalp and the basket. And not even, so this woman was wearing a kippah. So because she was wearing a kippah, ultimately it covered the mole. V'zimnin de mischazia, v'zimnin de lo mischazia. So both say it's possible that what? That he never saw it. Okay. Amar Rav Chisda, ha milsa migaver Rab Shmuel le'umar Rab Shila. So we'll say, this matter I heard from a great man. Who is great man of Shila? Noshcha kelev v'na'asem mekomot salekes. Ultimately, I'm going to say, so what happens if someone, or this will go just with the case of a woman was bitten on the leg by a dog, and as a result, the area of the bite shriveled up. Harez a mum. Ultimately, again, that's a mum. Amr Reb Chisda said, Kol ava bi'isha. If a woman has a deep voice, harez a mum. That's a mum. Shene'emar ki kolech arev umar'ech naveh. Because we'll say the pasuk in Shir Hashirim says, literally again, because your voice is pleasant and your countenance is beautiful. So the idea over here that a deep voice ultimately is considered to be a mum. So the Gemara says, Tana Rabbi Nasan bira bein dade ishe tefach. So I will say the Gemara continues to go through the cases of mum. And I will say, what's interesting about this, and again, because we don't really have too much time, because we have to daven slichos, so I will say, I'll just mention, why exactly this section is included here in the Gemara is an interesting discussion als the Rishonim and Achronim. But again, so bein dade isha tefach. So I will say the space between the dadayim of an isha, of a woman, is a tefach. Savar Rav Achab reid Rav Kamed Rav Ashi l'meimar tefach lema'al yusa. Amr Rav Ashi gabi mumin tanya. How can you say that tefach is preferable? After all, again, it's considered over here between the mumin. So the Gemara says v'kama Amr Abaye shalosh etzbos. That the proper spacing ultimately again is not a tefach, but rather 3 finger breadths. Tanya Rabbi Nasan Omer kol isha shedadeha gasin mishal chavroseha harei mum. So any woman whose dadayim are much larger than her friends is considered to be a mum. The kama, how much larger? Amrab Maisha bereid Rav Yoshua ben Levi mishmeid Rav Yoshua ben Levi tefach. Okay, Umiika ki hai gavna. Ultimately, again, I will say, is it possible for the dadaim to be that large? So the Gemara says, in the Amar Rabbi Barachana, Anira isi aravia achos sheshvila dadel achoreha venikas bina. Okay, nothing like first-hand testimony, right? So I'll say, so ultimately, again, good. He saw this woman who mamish nursed her child from behind. Okay, good. So we'll say, so the Gemara says as follows: L'tzion ye'amer ish v'ish yulad ba. It's absolutely beautiful Gemara. Absolutely beautiful Gemara. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk ultimately from Tehillim, and the Gemara says as follows: Tzion will say, listen to this pasuk. Tzion will say, "Ish v'ish yulad ba." This person and this person was born in it, and he will establish it on high. Now, both sides. If you take a look at Rashi over here, this is beautiful, beautiful Rashi. Rashi says, "Ulitzion Ya'amer." It's right across in Rashi. Ulitzion Ya'amer mishum da'ayri ba Rabbi Maisha nakit la. So I'll say the reason it's being brought down is because it's the same author. Ulitzion Ya'amer ish yulad ba la'asid lavo kisheyiskayim mikra shekasov ve'aviu eskalachechem min chala Hashem komakum shimtzu Yisrael yomra amim zem netzion. So I'll say this is a reference to the Messianic era. In the Messianic era, listen to how beautiful this is. When Klal Yisrael, when we bring karbanos to Hashem, the Goyim, the nations of the world will say, Ish yulad ba, that every single Jew was born in Sion. And Abba said there's an obvious problem, which is what? Not every single Jew is born in Sion. Sion is Yerushalayim, is Eretz Yisrael. So how do you say that every single Jew, Dr. Langbaum, this Gemara is an honor of you, Mamish, and they have your Aliyah, incredible. So let's say, so ultimately, what does it mean? What does it mean that every single person is born in Sion? Abba say, Amr Maisha, Braid Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Echad hanolad ba, ve'echad hamitzaper lir'oser. Abba say, listen to how beautiful this Gemara is. It means that whether you are born in Eretz Yisrael or you yearn for Eretz Yisrael, you are considered to be as if you have been born in Sion. If you born in Yerushalayim or you yearn for Yerushalayim, you are considered to be a ben Yerushalayim. Look at Rashi. Echad nolad ba ish yisera kadarish echad hanolad ba ve'echad hamitzaper lir'osa. So whether again you've been born in Yerushalayim or you desire to see Yerushalayim, yikra mibaneha. Ultimately, again, you will be called of the children of Yerushalayim, and you'll be brought to Yerushalayim. I will say, absolutely, absolutely beautiful. Absolutely magnificent. I'll just say something amazing. I saw brought down Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, ultimately, again, he was a contemporary of Rav Kook. So they did not see eye to eye, Rav Armi Yisrael Kohen Kook. They were, I'll call it, ideologically opposed on many different levels, but yet again had an incredible mutual respect. Their followers did not have respect for each other, but ultimately they themselves had respect for each other. Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld was known as to be an incredibly an honest individual, and incredibly meticulous with being an honest individual. They asked Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld the following question. Remember, Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, like Rav Kook, lived in, this was before the state of Israel, this was in British Mandate Palestine. They asked Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, is a person allowed to lie, to say that they were born in Palestine in order to be able to gain entry under the British? The British had very strict quotas, but if you were able to go ahead and say that you were born here, but you left, and now you want to come back, you were able to come back. So they asked Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, is a Jew allowed to lie and say that you were born in Eretz Yisrael in order to be able to come back? And Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld quoted the Gemara Maseches Ksuvas, Daf Ayin Ham and Aleph, and he said it's not a lie. He said if you are a Jew who yearns for Eretz Yisrael, then the pasuk makes it as if you've been born in Eretz Yisrael. He says again, quoting the pasuk, "L'tzion ye'amer ish yulad ba, ish yulad ba." There are two types of people who are born in Eretz Yisrael. There are those who are physically born in Eretz Yisrael, and those who are spiritually born in Eretz Yisrael. Those physically born, okay. Spiritually born, if you yearn for Eretz Yisrael, I'll say, if you have a longing in your heart for Eretz Yisrael, it's as if you've been born there. Absolutely beautiful. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, good. Amar Abai says, V'chad minahu Adif kitre minalan. Both say this is a fascinating pasuk. Literally, again, one of us, one Jew from Eretz Yisrael is better than 2 Jews of Bavel. Now, both say this is specifically referring to the Talmidei Chachamim. One Talmid Chacham from Eretz Yisrael is better than 2 Talmidei Chachamim from Bavel. Amar Rava, the Chad Minan, but 1 Jew from Bavel, Kisalik Lahasam, when he goes to Eretz Yisrael to learn, Adif Kitre Minayu, is as good as 2 Jews of Eretz Yisrael. So I will say, so this is actually incredible. So listen to this. So first Abai begins by saying, 1 Eretz Yisrael Jew is greater than 2 Babylonian Jews. But when a Babylonian Jew makes Aliyah, he's the equivalent to 2 Jews from Eretz Yisrael. So I was saying, sometimes what it means is like this. An Eretz Yisrael Jew sometimes has as much Kiddush as 2 Chutz La'aretz Jews. But when a Chutz La'aretz Jew who has had to fight for his Ruchnius comes to Eretz Yisrael, he could be just as strong as 2 Eretz Yisrael Jews. A pretty incredible Gemara. Because Rabbi Yirmiyah was a Bavel Jew. When he was in Bavel, often he didn't understand the conversations that were happening in the Beis Medrash. Yet, Kisalik Lahasam, ultimately when he went to Eretz Yisrael, Karilan Bavli Tipsha, he used to call us, he called us, the foolish Babylonians. So I will say, the dynamic that the Gemara seems to be describing is like this. The Ruchnius of Eretz Yisrael is stronger than the Ruchnius of Bavel. Therefore, again, when you compare Eretz Yisrael Jews to diaspora Jews, Eretz Yisrael Jews have greater Ruchnius than diaspora Jews. But when a diaspora Jew goes to Eretz Yisrael, moves to Eretz Yisrael, so what does a diaspora Jew come armed with, Rabbosai? A diaspora Jew has to fight. See, in Eretz Yisrael, Ruchnius is there. It's there. It's in the air. In Galus, you have to fight for your Ruchnius. So when you come to Eretz Yisrael with that fighting mentality, and now you're transplanted to the Kedusha of the land, your Ruchnius skyrockets. So when you compare Eretz Yisrael Jews to ultimately diaspora Jews, so the Eretz Yisrael Jew is greater. But when the diaspora Jew comes to Eretz Yisrael, he surpasses everyone who is there because he's used to fighting for every inch of his Ruchnius territory. When he brings that fighting spirit to Eretz Yisrael, the fighting spirit, combined ultimately with the natural Ruchnius of the land, allows him to accomplish dramatic things. Halavai Wishal Bizocha. So the Gemara goes weiter. Good. I'll just tell you also, by the way, the Sanzarav says something very beautiful. Sanzarav says about this idea that an Eretz Yisrael Jew is as great, ultimately, again, as 2 diaspora Jews, is why it's sweet. He says, this is why in Eretz Yisrael, you only need 1 day of Yom Tiv, and in Chutz La'aretz, you need 2 days of Yom Tiv. Because ultimately, again, the Ruchnius ratio is 2 to 1. There's 2 times as much Ruchnius in Eretz Yisrael as there in his Chutz La'aretz. So what I need 2 days to accomplish here in Chutz La'aretz could be accomplished in 1 day in Eretz Yisrael. Such says the Sanzarav. Says the Mishnah, Hayuba mumin va'od bebeis aviha. So we'll say if the woman, right, let's say she has a mum. So same case. Ultimately, again, where we're talking about women that could void the marriage. So Hayuba mumin va'od bebeis aviha. So ultimately, I will say, so now let's say, so here's the case. He was Mekadesher. And now, during Kiddushin, she's still living in her father's home. So he was Mekadesher. And I will say, what happens? It's discovered that she has mumin, right? But she's still living in her father's home. What's the halacha? Ha'av tzarich lahavi raya, shemishinis arsa hayu bamumin halalu, v'nistap kosadeyu. So it's upon the father to bring the proof that what? That the mumin developed post-Kiddushin. Right? So now we'll say, so it's post-Kiddushin, they discover mumin, the father has, the burden of proof is upon the father, the mumin developed post-Kiddushin, and therefore, again, so to speak, the Chassin's field has flooded. And we'll say, remember again, that's the expression we had in the beginning of the Masechta. Nichnes salushas habal, habal tzarich laviraya, shashlonis aris hayuba mumin elu. However, again, if the mumin are discovered after Nisuin, so then again, the burden of proof is upon the husband to prove that those mumin existed before Kiddushin, and ultimately, again, it's a mekachtos. When is this true? This whole discussion is only about mumin that are not visible, or in other words, that would not be visible, or they're underneath clothing, they're in covered areas. Aval on the days B'mum shebegalui eno yachal liton. Rabbi say any mum that was revealed, there are no tainas. Rabbi says because that's what we just learned. Because if a mum is visible, then what? You saw it. And if you saw it and you went through it, then anyway it means you accepted it. So aval mum shebegalui eno yachal liton. V'myesh merchatz ba'os sa'ir. However, Rabbi say if there's a bathhouse in the city, af mum shebeseiser eno yachal liton. Even women in covered parts of the body, ultimately, again, a husband cannot claim mekach tos. Why? Mipnei shubotka bekrovosav. Because they will say, what's going to happen? Because it was customary, apparently, that what would occur. So the husband's relatives would go to the bathhouse. And therefore, ultimately, again, they would see if the kala had any woman. Says the Gemara. So these are the two cases. So taima demaisia avraya. So remember again, case number one is now it's post kiddushin. Rachel, we're going to call her, is living in her father's home, and ultimately a mum is discovered. So what did the Mishnah say? The burden of proof is upon the father to prove that the mum developed post kiddushin, post erusin. Taima demaisia avraya. So ultimately, again, it's only if the father brings a proof. Halo maisia avraya. If the father would not bring a proof, habal mehemen. Ultimately, the husband is believed to say what? We'll say, remember again, what's Ruvain's claim over here? What's his claim? The mum preceded kiddushin, and this is a mekach tos. So, money, whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi say this is Rabbi Yoshua. He damar lomi pia anuchayin. Rabbi say ultimately again, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, because Rabbi Yoshua says that halacha l'maisa, we don't go ahead and simply live based on her testimony. Rashi points out the case in which this was said. Okay, so I will say, so now I want to point out, look at Rashi, Tab Rashi Abal Mehemen, Damra Hov Safeku, Imita Asa V'imlav, Hamid Mamon Al Cheskaso. Shabbos says, so just to point out what's happening over here. Ruvain was Mekadesh Rachel. After Kiddushin, she's living in her father's home, and a mum is discovered. The type of mum that would invalidate the Kiddushin. So what's happening over here? Father's claiming the mum just developed now, post kiddushin. In which case, husband, it's your problem. Husband, Ruvain's claiming no. The mum preceded erusin, therefore mekach tos. So the Mishnah said in that case the halacha is with the husband, namely the burden of proof is upon the father, which essentially becomes like a type of hamotzi mechaver alav haraya type of situation, right? She wants to prove that she's married with all the financial benefits. Ultimately, the burden of proof is upon you to determine that the mum developed post kiddushin. Ema seifa. Yet look at the end of the Mishnah. Nichnas alashas habal. If now we'll say what happens, the mum develops when after nisuin, or I should say not develops. The mum is discovered after nisuin, right? Habal tzarich lahavi raya. The husband, the burden of proof is upon the husband that halacha l'maisa what? That halacha l'maisa, the mum preceded the marriage. Taima, the maisi habal raya. Now ultimately, again, the husband is one who has to bring the proof. Halo maisi habal raya. If the husband would not bring proof, ha'av mehemen. Ultimately, again, the father would be believed. Be believed to say what? That the mum developed after nisuin. In other words, this Ruvain, she's yours. Right? This reflects the Rabbi Gamliel. The Amar Ne'emenes. Ultimately, and I both say that says that apparently she is believed. In other words, I both say, so the first part of the Mishnah seems to indicate that we don't accept, quote unquote, her testimony, because remember again, as much as it's the father advocating, it's her testimony as well. Second part of the Mishnah seems to indicate that we do accept her testimony. So what's going on? Amar Rabbi Lazar, Tavra, Misha Shanazu Lo Shanazu. So Rabbi Lazar says, you're right. Two different opinions in the Mishnah. I must say the Reisha is reflecting one opinion and the Seifa is reflecting a second opinion. Amar Rava, no. Lo tema Rabbi Yoshua lo azal basar. Amar Rava, lo tema Rabbi Yoshua lo azal basar chazaka dugufa klal. Elaki lo azal Rabbi Yoshua basar chazaka dugufa heicha deika chazaka demamona. To which Rava comes along and says, but 1 second. Even Rabbi Yoshua. Right? Even Rabbi Yeshua, who says that we do not go after the chazaka of her body, that's only when, ultimately, again, when there's a competing monetary chazaka. But ultimately, again, when there is no competing monetary chazaka, azil Rabbi Yeshua basar chazaka degufa. Ultimately, again, then Rabbi Yeshua will go after the physical chazaka. Now, what is this talking about? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, Lo tem Rabbi Yoshua lo azal basar chazaka de gufa afil b'makom she'in cheskas mamon omedes neidas. So remember again, Rabbi Yoshua is the one who said, Lomi pia anuchayin, that we don't just take her word. In other words, her word doesn't just simply determine the reality. Now, here's what's interesting. What's interesting about this is there's something called chazaka de gufa. Chazaka de gufa means that we kind of look at whatever. So for example, chazaka de gufa would say that we look at where she's holding physically, and where she's holding physically ultimately again would determine the reality. When doesn't Rabbi Yoshua accept chazaka de gufa? That's only when there is a competing monetary chazaka. Look at Rashi. Chazaka de mamona. So we'll say, for example, here, this would be a case of a competing monetary chazaka. So the Gemara says, this sanya, all right, we'll say, we'll stop over here actually, let's just finish this up. The sanya, in Baheres kodem l'seir lavan tameh. In seir lavan kodem l'baheres tahar. So we'll say, so for example, the Brisa says, if the Baheres, talking about over here, we'll say, by tsaras, so Baheres is the white spot. If the white spot came before the white hair, then ultimately again Tameh. Im Ser Lavan Kodum Baheres, if the white hair comes before the Baheres, star. Stafek, if you're not sure which came first, Tameh. If Rabbi Yeshua Amar Kea. Rabbi Yeshua says Kea. What's Kea? My Kea. Amarava Kea Tahar. Ultimately, again, it means tahar. So I will say, we'll stop over here for today. But again, I'm leaving you up a little bit on a cliffhanger. We're going to see Rava is going to track us out. Where we're leaving off, I will say right now, is that halacha l'maisa, it appears that there's two different authors of the Mishnah. The Reisha, the case ultimately where the mum is discovered ultimately in the father's home, seems to reflect one opinion. The mum being discovered after Nisuin seems to go ahead and reflect a different opinion. We don't like having the same Mishnah reflecting two different opinions. Rava is going to give us a different resolution tomorrow. But I apologize for the pace, but shkoyach. Have a great day.